Я, комисар Бинков, представлям вам.
Greetings, I, Commissar Binkov, present you China versus USA. In this scenario, USA intervenes in a South China Sea scuffle. Suddenly, war with China breaks out. Nukes, morale, or allies aren't modeled. But Japan will allow US operations from its existing bases. If hostilities escalate in a matter of days, the greatest US enemy would be geography. US would need time to bring in reinforcements. Currently, US has several fighter squadrons stationed in Japan. They are too weak against China on their own. They would wait for support. Hundreds of additional planes and SAMs would be ready on Japanese soil within a month. US Navy would take longer, due to distance and time needed to activate ships not ready for deployment. China could take the initiative before those US air forces come in numbers. Targets in mainland Japan would be farther away and carry a bigger political penalty. They would also be more easily defended, so China would focus its attacks on more worthwhile targets. Most immediate threat would be the Okinawa bases. A rain of missiles would follow. While China has a large ballistic missile inventory, majority of it would not reach past Okinawa. Cruise missiles can reach past it, but their numbers are not as large. US would have to pack a lot of planes per base to match the Chinese in numbers. But densely packed bases also mean more losses if those bases get attacked. China would follow up missile strikes on Okinawa with air force attacks. China would enjoy numerical superiority and perhaps even a favorable loss ratio. US would be left with unusable bases for as long as China can deny access. US has a vast stockpile of cruise missiles of its own, but they alone are not enough to deliver a fatal blow. War against China would require so many important targets to be hit that the shown inventory would be inadequate. Most of the targets would be repairable within the course of the war. Airbase elements and runways could be repaired within a day or so. Follow-up airstrikes would be needed, but US would lack those planes in the opening stage of the war. China is behind in high-endurance aerial reconnaissance. It also trails in number of special mission surveillance planes. Satellites-wise, China is somewhat closer to parity in some regards, but still trails behind overall. Still, due to limited basing space, US would not be able to use most of these planes at once. Better part of US bases would essentially be safe from continuous missile strikes. They would be too far away for unrefueled Chinese fighters. Chinese tanker fleet is quite small, and such attacks are unlikely to achieve the required concentration of firepower. Such airstrikes would involve vast losses for a small and temporary gain. China would choose not to attack. US also has Guam, but it is too far away for any tactical plane on its own. Extensive in-air refueling operations would have to be performed, cutting into the sortie rates. Guam could be more useful to US as a bomber base and means of patrolling the South and East China Seas. Civilian airports near Guam would also be put to military use. US tanker fleet is so huge that US could find space for only a portion of it. Average US tanker can double the range of up to a dozen US fighters. Guam would be safe from most missile strikes, but plane and submarine-launched cruise missiles could still target it. Still, the bases would be working even if temporarily shut down by strikes. Exploiting the small initial US presence and paused key base operations, China could send most of its fleet towards Guam, but it is unlikely Guam would be completely shut down for a week at a time. Adding local carrier groups, the US would have enough assets to fight such a force. Chinese Navy is numerous, but its ships are technologically behind and a lot of its fleet is better suited for coastal protection. It would lack the key air power projection. An open ocean battle would see China lose most of its fleet. Such incursion would likely not be undertaken. To get to targets in mainland China, one needs to deal with Chinese air forces. While they trail behind US forces in both quality and numbers, actual presence on the battlefield in the opening months would be on Chinese side. Training-wise, Chinese are on the average behind US pilots. sortie rates would favor China. US fighters would travel long distances to reach China, resulting in long missions and lower sortie rates. The defender would enjoy short intercepts and planes would be ready again sooner. But the Chinese are behind in number of multi-role planes, meaning the overall number of fighters or strike planes would suffer. With China losing its best planes and US taking over the initiative, overall loss ratio might become comparable despite US low numbers. Some months later, US Navy would come into full force. But no navy can use all its ships at once, and the Trans-Pacific deployments would shorten the combat deployment time for most of the US fleet. Still, the difference in numbers and capability is staggering. China would have to choose: keep its navy battling for the seas close to Okinawa, thus slowing down US airstrikes, or keeping its fleet tucked away around safer areas. US naval air defenses would be in position to further deny strikes on Okinawa. China would eventually run out of missiles and fall back after inevitable naval losses. After a period of clearing out most of the sea mines, majority of the East China Sea would become US playground. Carriers would come closer and strike at Chinese mainland. Chinese coastal defenses would still be dangerous. There would be raids from the air as well as by their submarine and littoral ship fleets. Once US rebuilds the potential of Okinawa bases, the real push against China would start. US bases on Japanese mainland would help against northwestern China, but Beijing will likely be too far away and only occasional raids would threaten it. Strikes along the Chinese coast would intensify. Knowing it can't control the seas, China would keep a defensive stance, under the protection of its powerful air defenses. Chinese SAM network is a mix of both old and new systems. While China has more ground SAM batteries than US, they are on the average of lesser reach and technology level. Location of US bases would mean Chinese defenses wouldn't need to cover much territory and could be concentrated. US would have a very hard time wearing down the Chinese defenses. It would wage a slow and meticulous campaign against them, a war of attrition where both sides would lose hundreds of aircraft. China would be down to its older planes by then, and loss ratio would favor the US. US would be confined to coastal airstrikes, as regularly going deeper inside China would be too dangerous. Occasional B-2 strikes against weapon factories might happen, but their fleet would quickly dwindle down to symbolic numbers. Dealing damage to the coast would eventually become easier as the defenses thin out. US would still have a large plane inventory to restock their bases, but amassing firepower would still be problematic. Bombing campaigns in the past involved more favorable conditions and almost no resistance. China would be continuously harassing the attackers. It has enough depth to keep its defenses from being completely destroyed, as well as keep its weapons production running in some capacity. After 6 to 12 months of air war to thin out the defenses, another year might be needed to inflict enough damage to Chinese infrastructure and economy. Outposts in the South China Sea would also fall. But to inflict serious damage, US would need to reach inside China, impossible without a ground invasion. That would require an amphibious landing of unprecedented size against an enemy which would dwarf the landing force. Without a large allied coalition against China and a proper land route, it wouldn't really be possible. Thus ground war would not be considered by US. The Chinese Navy would be in ruin, most of its air force and air defenses wiped out, as well as part of its coastal infrastructure destroyed. Trade-off would be dozens of US Navy's vessels sunk and over 1,000 combat planes lost. It would be a costly victory. Keep in mind, a politically more realistic scenario might involve full Japanese support, and it might require other allies. In such a case, the Chinese defenses would crack sooner, allied casualties would deflate, and damage inflicted would rise.